Well, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5 tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen. Hopefully you've been able to download and print the notes there. I put them in the group chat. And so they're there for you. Or like I said, at church, if you're at church, I print them out every Sunday. And so I put a stack of notes on the back table. So we'll be using chapter 5 the next 2 weeks. We'll be in chapter 5 for a couple of weeks. So tonight and next week. Let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint and we'll get started here. All right. And if someone can let me know if you can see the PowerPoint okay.
Looks good.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So this evening, we've got an interesting study because we're going to fast forward a number of years from the close of chapter 4. And we're actually going to fast forward to the very last night of the Babylonian Empire. You know, God had predicted through Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be replaced with another kingdom, that he was the head of gold and his kingdom was the head of gold, but that he would be replaced. And then we also saw the prophecy that I want to look at before we get started tonight. So hold your finger in Daniel 5 and go with me to Jeremiah chapter 27. Jeremiah chapter 27. And I want to just point out this prophecy because it, as you can imagine, when God predicts something's going to happen, it happens. And so I want to just kind of point that out as we go. But Jeremiah 27:5, the Lord says this: I have made the earth, the man and the beast that are on the ground by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed proper to me. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field I have also given him to serve him. And then notice this, verse 7. So all nations shall serve him and his son and his son's son until the time of his land comes. And then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. And we're going to fast forward to that time of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson and when the kingdom is taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. So we're going to look at that tonight, the events surrounding that fateful evening when the Babylonian Empire was taken over by the Medo-Persians. And so we're going to do just kind of as an introduction to chapter 5, I want to do a little bit of historical background on the family tree of Babylon. And what you'll notice is number 1 says from the end of chapter 4 until the beginning of chapter 5, you will notice that Babylon has a new king. His name is Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And so just a quick history of the Babylonian Empire. Nabopolassar was Nebuchadnezzar's father, and he ruled the emerging Neo-Babylonian Empire from 626 to 605 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar at the time served as his military general and chief administrator. Now, you may recall in 605 BC, that was the year that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, they took the first royal captives from Judah. This is when Daniel was taken into exile into Babylon. It was 605 BC. So that was the same year Nebuchadnezzar's father died. It was also the same year that Nebuchadnezzar became the king. And he became the king after his father's death in that year, 605 BC. And he was actually the mastermind of Babylon's greatest conquest and its rise to world domination. He ruled from 605 to 562 BC. So roughly 45 years Nebuchadnezzar ruled. And that's what we've been looking at really from Daniel 1 through Daniel 4. It's within that time period of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Now, Nebuchadnezzar died, and when he died, his son Amel-Marduk ruled Babylon, and his rule was from 562 to 560. It was very short-lived, so just 2 years, a little less than 2 years. And he was a very weak and immoral ruler. And because of that, Neri-Glisar, one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-law, is said to have assassinated him and replaced him. Now, you have a chart. I don't know if you've looked at it yet, but your notes are stapled together. But on page 2 of your notes, right at the top, you've got a family tree chart. And instead of ML Marduk on your family tree chart, it's going to say evil Merodach. And that's the same person. He just is called different things in different historical accounts. So, but that's who we're talking about there. And so you can kind of see he's on, as you're coming down the family tree chart, as you're looking at it, he would be on the left. He would be the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar had these two daughters that married men that would become also rulers in the Babylonian Empire. But we'll kind of work our way there. We're just going to kind of work from left to right here. And so Neriglissar, he was the son-in-law, married to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, assassinated and replaced Amel Marduk. And then Neriglissar ruled Babylon for 4 years, 560 to 556 BC, and he's said to have died of natural causes. And so after him, you can see that his son, Labashi Marduk, ruled Babylon for about 9 months. He was deemed too young or too immature to rule, and he too was assassinated. And then you kind of keep moving your way down the family chart, and after his death, Nabonidus, who was another of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-laws, rose to power. And he technically ruled from 556 until Babylon's fall in 539 BC. And you can kind of see him on the far right of that family tree on page 2. Now, Nabonidus, although he was the supreme king, because of his archaeological interests that were outside the city of Babylon, he often allowed his son Belshazzar to rule as king in his place. And this is who we're gonna pick up in Daniel 5:1. And Nebuchadnezzar had, just put this in perspective, Nebuchadnezzar had only been gone 23 years. He'd been dead for 23 years. And yet a string of weak rulers had followed in his absence. And at this time, we don't really know, but it appears that Daniel had either retired from public life or he had been removed from office. He doesn't seem to have a very prominent role under Nabonidus and Belshazzar, his son, during this time. And we'll kind of observe that as we go through the story. But when we get to this story, he had been in captivity now in Babylon for nearly 66 years. Now, remember, what was the amount of time of the exile that was predicted in Jeremiah? It was 70 years. Okay, so we're almost out of that time period. And so all of this that we just looked at, this history, and we'll kind of go back over it again briefly with the chart, happened over the course of 23 years. So this is a lot of upheaval. People getting assassinated, being replaced, people dying of natural causes. That they'd had a little bit of longevity with Nebuchadnezzar, but they had all of this upheaval in the empire. So here's that family tree chart. You've got Nabopolassar, that's Nebuchadnezzar's father, and we see how long he reigned. Nebuchadnezzar was his right-hand man, his chief military general. And so when his dad passed away, Nebuchadnezzar became the king. And you can see his reign was, again, roughly, 45 years or so. And in his reign, the start of his reign also coincided with the first exile or deportation of Jews. There were two others, right? The final being in 586 BC when he also destroyed the temple and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, his son, evil Merodach, or as the one other description was ML Marduk, that's another way you'll find his name, began to reign, but he reigned for about 2 years, so maybe a little less than 2 years. And he was replaced by Neriglissar. We saw that, and then Neriglissar's son replaced him when he died of natural causes, Labashi Marduk. He was viewed as too young, too inexperienced, too immature. He was murdered and assassinated, and Nabonidus took over. And then Nabonidus shared really his rule with his son as he pursued archaeological interest. And anytime he was out of the capital city, it was like he gave the son his whistle, so to speak, or his scepter while he was gone. And so that's where we pick up in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. And it's a really, really interesting time because the final day of the Babylonian Empire started with a party. And that's what we're going to read here in verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And, one of the things that's interesting about this section of Daniel is for centuries, critics of the Bible would use the lack of extra biblical historical information concerning Belshazzar to declare the Bible as inaccurate. In other words, they would say, oh, well, Belshazzar is not mentioned in any kind of secular literature, and thus the Bible's wrong. And basically what secular literature would show is the order of kings, as we just looked at on that timeline, and Belshazzar wasn't mentioned. In fact, when you look at the historical record, Nabonidus was still technically the official king when the Babylonian Empire fell. So when Daniel identifies him as the king in verse 1, they'd say, oh, Daniel's got an error, thus you can't trust Daniel and you can't trust the Bible. That was kind of the conclusion by these critics. And so their claim that the book of Daniel gave false information was actually finally disproved when archaeologists found a clay tablet left by King Nabonidus on which he mentioned his son Belshazzar by name. And this is one of the cases where the Bible and the information that's contained therein actually preceded archaeological finds to support it. In other words, the Bible was always accurate, but then archaeological finds were found much later that confirmed and verified what the Bible said. Now, what's interesting about that is when you compare the Bible to other holy books like the Quran or the Book of Mormon, they actually have constant archaeological discoveries that prove them wrong. The Bible is always the opposite. Archaeological discoveries always support and validate what the Bible has recorded. And so this verse, as we look at verse 1, introduces us to what was happening on the last day of the Babylonian Empire. Now, according to historians, King Cyrus of Persia had been encamped outside the city with his armies for 3 months prior to this. So the Persian armies are just literally have surrounded the city of Babylon, and they've been there for 3 months. But apparently, Belshazzar was not worried, since the city was considered impenetrable and was said to have housed provisions that could sustain a 23-year siege. Now, that's amazing. We don't live in those times where we fear about being sieged or being surrounded. But, in a siege, armies would surround a city. They wouldn't allow supplies in. They wouldn't allow supplies out. Very quickly, cities that were unprepared or not very well defended might run out of supplies in a couple of months, and then they would start, starving to death. It was a terrible thing. Then they would quit and give up. Well, Babylon was so impenetrable. I'm trying to use big words I probably can't pronounce. Impenetrable. That they, honestly, they could have lasted for 23 years. That's how well prepared and how guarded this city was. So a couple of quick points on that. Remember, the city was surrounded by 25-foot thick walls, not 25-foot tall walls, 25-foot thick walls. And the walls had 260 towers, each spaced 160 feet apart. And so by all ancient standards, this city was impenetrable. And so due to the presence of Cyrus's military, Babylonian rulers from the entire kingdom had probably sought refuge in Babylon, where they felt secure enough to assemble for a colossal drinking party. And so again, this explains most likely in verse 1 why Belshazzar made this great feast, and he had 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in the presence of 1,000. It seems like a big party, but probably the reason they were all there is because this siege, the aggressive posture of the Persian army.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
AI's taking over my computer. Okay, so let's keep going. And so that kind of sets the stage. Verses 2 through 9, we see what happens. It's the handwriting on the wall. Verse 2, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Now, we don't know why Belshazzar decided to desecrate these Jewish temple objects, but he did. I don't know if it was a pride thing. We don't, obviously I think it was a pride thing. But we don't know why he thought of that right in the middle of this party, especially with an army outside of his walls. But Belshazzar, had he known his history, should have known not to blaspheme God, Yahweh, or to desecrate his temple vessels. For him to have singled out these vessels and ordered them brought out after nearly 70 years in storage was unquestionably intentional. And this is one of those things that, if you recall back in Daniel 4:37, Nebuchadnezzar had said in his report to the nation, to the empire, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and no one can restrain his hand, speaking of Yahweh. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. And what's so crazy is Belshazzar would have been alive during this time. And so this entire experience with Nebuchadnezzar, which was his grandpa, watching his grandpa behave like an animal, watching his grandpa lose his mind for 7 years the way that he did, really should have been enough to convince this young man that he didn't want to incite the Jewish God Yahweh, even if he didn't believe in him. He should have at least had some kind of a superstitious, if you will, fear of the God of the Jews, and yet he singles him out almost to desecrate these Jewish temple objects for some reason. So we don't really understand why he did it, but clearly he did it, and it was done in pride, thinking too highly of himself. Also in Daniel 3:29, his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had decreed that no one should ever offend the God of Israel. Surely Belshazzar had also heard this story as well. In fact, any conversation he would have had with his grandfather, he would have been aware of the situations that his grandfather had ran into with the God of the Jews. And so it was no trivial matter for Belshazzar to desecrate these vessels that had been set apart for worshiping the King of Heaven. There was something prideful and intentional about his decision to do this. And so he could have defied any other god without suffering, but to have defied the creator of the universe, the God of Israel, would bring dreadful consequences. And so at the very time they drank from the vessels, you notice that they also praised their false god. So it wasn't even like they just used the vessels to drink out of. They were intentionally drinking out of the vessels and then praising their own gods, worshiping other gods. And so he was flirting with destruction. And so he's got his enemy encamped nearby. He throws a party, he got drunk, and then he commits sacrilege against God Almighty. The idols, as we'll see, that they were praising as they drank, had no voice, no life, or no ability to rescue him. And so God, allows people to make their own decisions. And this is true even in our day. And even though he knows their sinful actions will ultimately bring them calamity, people can make their choices, but they cannot choose their consequences. And that just seems to be a biblical principle throughout the course of time. God gives us the freedom to make choices, but what he doesn't give us the freedom to choose is the consequences. And so you've got all sorts of freedom in the world. You can make decisions any way you want to. And obviously you want the Word of God to inform those decisions as best you understand. But understand that decisions come with consequences, and we're going to see the consequences for Belshazzar here in a second. But it just kind of reminds me of a couple of verses in Proverbs. We look at Proverbs as wisdom literature. And so in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 30 through 32, we read, "They would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke. Therefore they shall eat of the fruit of their own way and be filled to the full with their own fancies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them." Oftentimes there are people in our lives, maybe ourselves included, and it just seems like every time we turn around, something's going wrong. Every time we look at this person, they've got another trial, just a huge trial, just falling on their lap. Now, sometimes life is just that way, and that's very true. But there's also cases where people just make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and they're just reaping the consequences of their own decisions. Now, these aren't consequences they would choose for themselves, but as a result of their just continued string of decision making, they receive the fruit of their own ways, this verse says. And so obviously there are some things that difficulties of consequences that people could avoid if they begin to make decisions based on biblical thinking or divine viewpoint. But obviously that's not the case every time, but it is the case in some situations. And so we're going to see Belshazzar, the decision he made here is going to have tremendous ramifications. In fact, he's going to lose the Babylonian kingdom on this very night of the party. And so let's read verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And so God took up Belshazzar's direct or possibly indirect challenge, giving him the benefit of the doubt if he didn't realize this was a big deal. Either way, it was a challenge to God's authority and a challenge to his name and who he was. And so he interrupted the party. And I like that phrase, that in the same hour, because it emphasized that as soon as God was defied through the blasphemous desecration of the temple vessels, the fingers appeared. And so it was a sudden and immediate appearance. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that God was showing Belshazzar that this hand, these fingers writing on the wall were a direct result of the decision he had made to pull the vessels out, to drink in them, and then to praise other gods while drinking out of these vessels. And so now let's look at the king's response in verse 6. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. This is starting to sound familiar, isn't it, as we look at these narrative portions in Daniel. Verse 9, Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. And so the king's overall response here was one of shock and bewilderment, because he himself had observed with his own eyes that the back of this hand, seeing a floating hand or seeing floating fingers writing something, that would be a little overwhelming and scary for all of us. But he saw the back of the hand that wrote on the plaster of the wall. Now, we're not told how large or small the hand was, but it was clearly visible and viewable from where Belshazzar sat. So he responded a couple ways. In verse 6, we see that the text tells us his countenance changed, and so you can tell it's no longer a party atmosphere full of mirth and drinking games. He was terrified. Belshazzar was terrified, as rightly he should be, and as many of us would be. It says that his thoughts troubled him. He probably began to think, oh no, what have I done? And although he didn't know what the message meant, he probably knew who he had offended. And so he's running through his mental Rolodex, which God did I offend? Although it's probably pretty clear that he had offended the God of the Jews because of the desecration of those temple vessels. Notice the phrase, the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. And so he was literally shaking in his boots. And what's so ironic about this is the armies of the Persians brought the king little fear, but a disembodied man's hand sobered him instantly. And then we see that he cried aloud, to bring in the wise men of Babylon. Unfortunately, the writing on the wall was a total mystery to these wise men. They had been unable to help in the past. We've seen that a bunch with Nebuchadnezzar's divine dreams. And once again, they failed to interpret God's written message. And again, what's so interesting about the book of Daniel, especially in these narrative portions, one of the themes that, I try to keep emphasizing that I think we see is God is just putting the bankruptcy of man's wisdom on full display throughout the Babylonian Empire. And every time something was going on that they didn't understand, they would turn to their wise men, and their wise men would let them down. And then what we'll see is that then they're forced to turn to a Jewish prophet, Daniel, because God is the one who gives him this understanding. And it just shows God's wisdom as superior to man's wisdom. Now, what's so fascinating again is you would just expect at some point in the story of Daniel that when something like this happened in the life of the king, he would just learn from the past and say, "Oh, well, our wise men probably don't know. Let me just go straight to Daniel. Let me just go straight to the big dog and get the interpretation." But we've seen over the course of the first 4.5 chapters of Daniel, they weren't learning from their experiences. They kept going back to this broken, shallow source of wisdom every time, and just realizing that they couldn't do anything with it. And so in typical Babylonian royalty fashion, Belshazzar offers great riches and promotion to anyone who could interpret the inscription. Now, unfortunately for the king, none of his wise men could do it. They couldn't interpret the writing, and God had once again stumped these minions of Satan. When no one could read the writing or explain the message, all merriment ceased. And so you can understand, he's looking for an explanation. They can't provide it. By the way, I don't know if you noticed too, this kind of fits with the historical record that Nabonidus was the official ruler of Babylon, that his son was kind of his second, Belshazzar was his second. And then notice what he offers the person who can interpret his dream in verse 7. He offers them the third spot in the kingdom. And that makes sense, right? Because Nabonidus is number 1, Belshazzar is number 2. So the highest he could offer anyone in the kingdom would be the third spot. And that would be for the person who could interpret the writing on the wall. And so in verse 9, as the different groups clustered to discuss the meaning, and that one by one failed to offer any explanation, the king's fear intensified. You can kind of see that conclusion in verse 9. It says, "Then, after they couldn't interpret it, he was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished." And so this crisis illustrated again the inability of these practitioners of the dark arts to give any answers. And so the book of Daniel records crisis after crisis in which God's servants relied on God's faithfulness to answer life's perplexities. And so Daniel would once again, as we'll see, would be promoted to a place of authority for something that God did through him. So something he did in and through him. And we'll kind of see how Daniel comes into the story here. And how this is going to work is Belshazzar is going to be given some advice from the queen. Okay. And we're going to see that she gives some really good advice. Let's see in verse 10 what she says. "The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, 'O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change.'" By the way, the fact that she came to the banquet hall probably indicates that she wasn't taking part in this party. Okay, so she was close by, but not really a part of the party. Verse 11, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." All right, so in verses 10 through 11, the way this verse or these verses describes the sequence of events It appears that quite possibly the queen was not at this drunken feast, but she was close enough to hear of her husband's dilemma, and she came in to calm the situation and give advice. Now, it actually, and we put husband there just because that seems to be the natural understanding of it, but it really, technically, it's virtually impossible to know the actual identity of this queen. Some speculate that she was Belshazzar's mother, so the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, maybe the wife of Nabonidus, or could have been his grandmother, one of the wives of Nebuchadnezzar. Either way, Daniel referred to as a queen in this passage, and it's mentioned in the first point. She could have been Belshazzar's wife. We really don't know, but she has this at least a historical perspective of who Daniel was, what he's been able to do in the past, and it was exactly what the king needed to hear in this moment. So again, whoever she was, the queen knew Babylon's history, and she knew exactly the right man to turn to in the kingdom who would be able to interpret the dream. And so again, was she one of Nebuchadnezzar's wives? So had she actually seen Daniel do this for her husband? Or was she just a student of history? We really don't know. There's nothing really to identify this queen to us in the story. This man, of course, that she recommends was Daniel. And she reminded the king how Daniel had interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams and how he'd been made chief over all the wise men in Babylon. So just as Nebuchadnezzar had done, she referred to Daniel in a way pagan people could understand, saying that he had a spirit of the holy gods. So she's still, in that culture, setting him apart in some way as having something unique about him. But her polytheism bled through, right? In other words, he's a divine person. He's spiritually minded, but she's still viewing things through her polytheistic pagan worldview. So this is the nicest way to say he's a servant of God, but this is from her polytheistic worldview. And so after a lengthy discourse on Daniel's qualifications, the queen urged Belshazzar to summon him. Now it's interesting that she used Daniel's Hebrew name, not his Babylonian name. So she may have believed in God like King Nebuchadnezzar did, or she may have respected Daniel in such a way because of what he had done in the past that she called him by his Hebrew name. But it is interesting that she calls him Daniel, and then she says whom the king named Belteshazzar. So she didn't lead out with his Babylonian name, but rather his Hebrew name. And so there's some show of honor there by doing so. And so now we're going to see the king summon Daniel. So he's going to follow the advice of the queen. And in verse 13, let's read verses 13 through 16, and then we'll talk about those verses. So then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be, again, the third ruler in the kingdom." And so the king makes an offer to Daniel. I think in verse 13 and 14, we see that he knew more about Daniel than he cared to admit. This information about Daniel being a Jewish deportee did not come from the queen. So maybe when she mentioned his name, he's like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that guy. I know who that guy is," or I remember some stories about him. So he kind of brings up some things that he remembers. Now, the fact that Belshazzar had never personally met Daniel, in verse 14, he uses this phrase, "I've heard of you," highlights the probability that Daniel was no longer in a place of authority in Babylon. In fact, when we leave Daniel in Daniel chapter 4, he's kind of second in command, right, to Nebuchadnezzar. So he was a very high position. If he was still in that level of position, then Belshazzar would have known him. But again, at this point in Daniel's life, at this point in the history of the nation, after that 23 years of just leadership upheaval, Daniel was probably no longer in a place of authority in Babylon. And it's really interesting because as he is talking to Daniel, it's interesting that he mentions Daniel's ethnic status in captivity and not his long life of service to the Babylonian administration. In fact, you see in verse 13, he mentions Judah twice. Now that's fascinating because Daniel has been a faithful steward and a faithful servant of the Babylonian Empire longer than Belshazzar has been alive. He's been there for 66 years, and he's done nothing but excel in every role and position that the Babylonian government has placed him in. And so it's very kind of snotty, if you will, of this young guy to say, oh yeah, you're one of the Jewish captives, instead of saying, oh wow, you've really served our country, you served my grandfather faithfully. He doesn't focus on that. He focuses on the fact that he was one of the Jewish captives that had been deported some, over 60 years prior. Now, the reason for this is he may have been trying to intimidate Daniel or exert his power or authority, just kind of being prideful by reminding everyone in earshot that Daniel had been brought as a captive from Judah, that he himself was royalty. There's a lot of gamesmanship obviously going on, a lot of pride there for sure. But what we see is, despite his terror from the handwriting on the wall, he takes this opportunity to slightly belittle Daniel, again, proclaiming that he was one of the exiles from Judah when he could have praised his years of faithful civic service. So it's just kind of an observation, and just by the way he addresses him shows a little level of disrespect. And so the king recounted the queen's words describing Daniel's unparalleled wisdom. But once again, he expresses it in true pagan style that Daniel has the spirit of the gods. So when you see that in verse 14, in the Aramaic, the word God is plural. So he's not saying the spirit of God like the spirit of Yahweh. He's using that in the plural. So he's a spirit of the gods. He's just like, you're set apart. You're a spiritual guy. You worship, basically, is kind of the idea. And so verse 15, as we see this again, it's just one more reminder of this principle we've been seeing over and over and over again. The bankruptcy of human wisdom for the most powerful man in the most powerful empire of the world. He needed to see that up close and personal. Nebuchadnezzar had seen it multiple times. Now here's his grandson getting to see it up close and personal. And what's so interesting too is when you look at these men in verse 15, these are the men that Daniel had been in charge of for much of his life of public service. So these are some of the men whom he had trained. These are some of the men that had probably benefited from his training, learning most likely about the true God. And again, it's this group of men that the Magi in the Christmas story derive from. Okay, they come out of these group of men, but still, their methods and ways were bankrupt when compared, obviously, with the ways of God and the way that He reveals truth to His servants. And so in verse 16, again, God creates this situation, even as He is about to remove the kingdom of Babylon, to declare and remind everyone that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. And once again, just as it kind of pointed out, in verse 16, he once again promises to Daniel that he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Again, supporting the archaeological historical records that Nabonidus was number one, Belshazzar was number two. And so the highest role that he could offer Daniel is number three. But as we're going to see, especially as Daniel interprets the dream, basically he just offered him the third position on the Titanic, right? The third ruling spot on the Titanic, because the Babylonian ship is going down. It's going down tonight. So Daniel's going to give him the interpretation, and you're going to see next week. Daniel's just like, whatever. You can give me the third position, but this kingdom's going down tonight. And so we'll kind of stop there for the evening and kind of pick up there next week. And so let me just kind of pull my screen back up. Let me just really quickly see if there's anybody have any questions or comments. Did anybody miss any of the blanks that were on the PowerPoint. We'll take that time here for a few minutes.
Pastor, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, Aldi.
I heard another analogy about how he calls Belshazzar calls or the queen calls Belshazzar's father.
Uh-huh.
And how that means they didn't used to, I mean, nowadays you wouldn't say my father if it was your grandfather.
Right.
So back in those times, they used to refer to someone that was way back as your father.
Yes. Good point. Yeah. In fact, even at this time in history, the Jews would often refer to Abraham as their father, but obviously he's many generations away. So yeah, but they would refer to their grandfather as their father. It was just a term of, familiar. I'm related. I come from him. So yeah, good point. Very good point pointing that out. All right, anybody else? Yeah, hey Dean. Go ahead, bro.
Hey, Pastor John.
Hey,
Is
bud.
there anything in the Bible that indicates how high the wall was? You mentioned it was 25 feet thick. Does it say how high the walls were?
I think they do, but I don't have that in these notes. So I'll look that up and try to report back.
Okay, just curiosity.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think I think I've seen that somewhere in previous notes maybe, but I could be confusing it with Nahum, because we looked at some details about Assyria and the city of Nineveh, and I think I might be thinking that, but I'll look and let you know.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Brett.
All right, bro.
Hey, John, I got a quick question.
Yeah, Rick.
How many kingdoms occupied Babylon? Do you know?
How many kingdoms? Like, you mean?
Because I think didn't Persia take over Babylon?
Yes. Yeah. So and it was a joint, and we'll look at that when we get to chapter 6. It was a joint group. It was the Medes and the Persians, and they would call that the Medo-Persian Empire. And so they jointly took over Babylon. And then Babylon it was just swallowed up by the Medo-Persian Empire pretty quickly, actually very quickly, overnight. The Babylonian Empire just ended. History tells us even without a battle, which is just mind-blowing. Yeah.
And after the Medo-Persians,
then it was Greece.
Alexander the Great take it over?
That's it. Alexander the Great was next. It was Greece. And then
Rome.
Greece they reigned over the world for hundreds of years, and then it was Rome. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks. Yep, you bet. All right, anybody else? All right. Well, it's good to see everyone on tonight. It's good to see Zion again on. Thanks, Zion, for coming out.
Hey.
Hey.
Yeah.
Hey, man, good to see you on here.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you too.
Okay. And then, everyone else, thanks for coming out. Great to have you tonight. We'll pick back up next week. We'll finish up Daniel chapter 5, and then we'll be on to Daniel 6. We'll finish that. That'll be kind of the completion of the narrative portions of Daniel. Once we're finished with Daniel 6, we'll kind of take a break on Sunday night for the rest of the year as we kind of come into the holiday season. And then we'll pick back up after the new year with all the prophetic portions of Daniel. So we'll kind of scoop back in and look how these compare with Revelation and other prophecies in the New Testament, especially as it relates to eschatology, which is something I know that we have an interest in. So we'll do that. That's kind of the game plan. Let me close this with a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for this evening. Thank you that even as we're setting the stage for the interpretation of the handwriting on the wall, that we see that you are a God who is in control, that you control nations, you move history the way that you want to move it, you do exactly what you say you're going to do. And so We just love the fact that you are unchanging in that way, and that even today in 2023, you are a God that we can trust and rely upon for anything going on in our life. But clearly, Lord, you want us to trust and rely upon you for salvation from our sin problem, the sin debt that we've incurred because of the way that we've broken your law. We're so thankful for Jesus and what he did for us to deliver us from that sin debt and to provide a righteousness equal to your own. And so we're very grateful for that. We're also grateful that you care about our daily lives. You want to meet our needs. And so we pray as we go from this study that we would really just enjoy fellowship with you consistently this week. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for coming out. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.